The first case begins with a woman named Greta Dudko. Born in Lithuania, Greta immigrated to Ireland and became a highly respected nurse. Her career showed real promise and a dedication to helping others. But her professional life soon crumbled as substance abuse took over. After showing up to work under the influence, she was suspended, triggering a dark and rapid downward spiral. Greta married a man named Vitaly Dudko, and they had a young son. But the marriage strained, prompting Greta's mother, Anna Bhatian, to move from Lithuania to Ireland to help raise the child. Anna took on the burden of raising her grandson while Greta fought her personal demons. Inside the home, tension simmered. Greta's substance abuse rapidly worsened as she began mixing alcohol with heavy prescription medications meant for anxiety and sleep. On Christmas Eve in 2010, a bitter argument erupted between Greta and her mother. During the clash, Anna spat out words that Greta found deeply offensive. Anna attacked her daughter's parenting, threatening to take the young boy back to Lithuania. For Greta, already unstable and highly intoxicated on a cocktail of pills and alcohol, those harsh words sparked an explosive rage. Greta turned violent, slamming her mother's head against a wall. She then attacked Anna with a heavy glass bottle, inflicting fatal blunt force trauma. Could drugs truly warp a mind this badly? Once the violence ended, Greta finally dialed emergency services. When first responders arrived, she tried to spin the tragedy as a terrible accident. But the grim forensic evidence told a completely different story. Anna's severe wounds pointed to a deliberate attack rather than a fall. Investigators combed the crime scene. The trauma patterns showed extreme, deliberate force. Autopsy findings revealed multiple blows that no accident could explain. During intense police interrogation, Greta finally confessed to the killing, but tried to justify her actions by claiming extreme provocation. She focused heavily on the painful insults to her parenting and the threat to take her son. Her lawyers would later argue that the toxic mixture of alcohol and pills had totally destroyed her judgment. Experts testified that combining these specific substances can trigger highly unpredictable, violent outbursts by completely stripping away a person's natural inhibitions. Greta finally stood trial for the murder of her mother, but that first trial collapsed when the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. This hung jury forced a retrial, and the second courtroom battle lasted 11 grueling days. Prosecutors laid out the brutal forensic findings, proving the attack was highly deliberate. They detailed the bitter argument and the vicious threats made that night. The defense fought back, insisting that the drugs in Greta's system had completely compromised her mind. In 2014, after an 11-day trial, the jury found Greta guilty of murder. After carefully weighing the dark evidence, the jury decided that regardless of what substances she had consumed, Greta had intentionally inflicted the brutal injuries that ultimately cost her mother her life. In Ireland, a murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life behind bars. She was sentenced to life, though she quickly launched an appeal citing legal errors. But in 2018, the court rejected her appeal, finding no errors to justify overturning the conviction. As of 2026, Greta Dudko remains locked away inside the Docus Center at Mountjoy campus in Dublin, the primary high-security prison for female offenders in Ireland. Our next case follows a repeat offender whose release led to further tragedy. Meet Nicole Flagg. In 2015, in Pleasant Ridge, Ohio, the 43-year-old was charged with murdering her 61-year-old mother, Mervinia Lowe. This was far from Nicole's first brush with the law. Back in 2003, she had been convicted of involuntary manslaughter and robbery for the death of Jeffrey Brown, serving 8 years before being released. Mervinia Lowe worked at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, remembered by her family as the kindest soul they ever knew. She had 2 children, including Nikole and a son named Maurice Allen. On April 10, 2015, a dark event unfolded at her home. Nikole had quietly arrived at her mother's house. A violent confrontation erupted, leaving Mervinia stabbed multiple times. Investigators soon discovered a chilling financial motive behind the attack. Nikole looted the home, grabbing cash, credit cards, a phone, and even her mother's luxury car, using it to flee and hide from police for nearly 2 weeks. But first, she desperately tried to scrub the crime scene. She poured cleaning supplies everywhere to erase any trace of her crime. Yet, Forensic science would expose the truth anyway. Nobody found the body right away. Disturbed by a strange voicemail, Maurice Allen requested a welfare check on his mother. When the police finally entered, they found Mervinia deceased inside. Her horrific wounds showed she had been stabbed repeatedly. We have to ask ourselves how someone commits such a horror after already serving time for a similar crime. Nikole did not run to the police. She managed to stay on the run for 12 long days. During those days, investigators frantically built their case. They analyzed the bloody scene, interviewed witnesses, and tracked her every movement. On April 22nd, Nikole finally surrendered to police. She was immediately booked and charged with murder, along with counts of heavy theft and tampering with a crime scene. The high-profile trial soon began in Hamilton County Common Pleas Court. Prosecutors presented damning forensic proof, displaying the numerous stab wounds and obvious signs of a cleanup. Maurice Allen took the stand, sharing details about his mother's life and the ominous voicemail that led to the search. The state proved Nikole had looted the house, establishing a clear robbery motive. Her past criminal record for nearly identical violence revealed a terrifying, repeating pattern. In December 2016, the jury convicted Nikole of aggravated murder, recognizing the brutality of her actions, along with robbery, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. Jurors reached this decision quickly after reviewing every piece of evidence presented. The stack of convictions truly reflected the sheer horror of her actions. On January 9, 2017, Judge Stephen Martin delivered the sentence. Nikole received a life sentence without parole, plus an additional 15 years behind bars. At the hearing, Nikole spoke up, refusing to show remorse. She insisted she was innocent of the murder, but the chilling physical evidence and the jury's verdict spoke much louder. Maurice Allen addressed the courtroom, pouring out his grief over the loss of his mother. He tearfully reminded everyone that Mervinia was a wonderful woman, cruelly stolen from them by her own daughter. Today, Nicole Flagg resides at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Ohio. She will spend the rest of her days there. This case shows us how a history of past violence shapes the heavy hand of justice. For Mervinia Lowe's family, especially Maurice, the verdict brought some closure but could never replace her. Now, let's look at another tragedy built on secrets. Simona Zafirovska in Brisbane. A 22-year-old Simona Zafirovska grew up believing her adoptive mother, Radica, was actually her biological parent. The two had immigrated from Macedonia to start anew. Those who knew Radica described her as an incredibly kind and generous woman. But behind closed doors, their relationship had grown increasingly hostile. Weeks before October 2016, Radica privately told a reporter that things at home were getting very dark. On October 28 in 2016, Radica lay fast asleep inside her quiet suburban Brisbane home. Under cover of darkness, Simona slipped into her bedroom armed with heavy planks of synthetic wood, striking her sleeping mother repeatedly. The brutal blows shattered her skull and caused horrific injuries. Radica died from the brutal, blunt force injuries she suffered. The relentless beating suggested pure, unbridled rage. Moments later, Simona dialed emergency services to report the tragedy. On the call, she frantically claimed an intruder had broken in and brutally attacked her mother. It was a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. When the police arrived, they immediately started searching for signs of this mysterious home invader. But the crime scene did not back up her story. Strange inconsistencies immediately put investigators on high alert. What drives a child to turn on the woman who raised her? Soon, forensic investigators uncovered a critical piece of evidence. The shards of artificial wood used to beat the victim were hidden right in Simona's bedroom. If a random killer had done this, the murder weapons never would have ended up in her room. Detectives even searched the drains and pipes for any traces of blood the fleeing killer might have left behind. They found absolutely nothing. Every single clue pointed directly to an enemy who was already inside the home. Police placed Simona under arrest for interrogation. Throughout the intense questioning, she stuck to her lies, spinning elaborate details about the mysterious intruder. But the physical evidence told a completely different story, and the detectives kept pressing for the truth. Ultimately, Simona was charged with murder, and the case headed to trial at the Brisbane Supreme Court. Over a 3-week trial, prosecutors laid out the forensic proof that shattered her intruder alibi. In 2019, the jury found Simona guilty of taking her mother's life. At her sentencing, the judge called the intruder story highly elaborate. The court made it clear that Radica was a devoted mother who did nothing to deserve such a horrific end. Simona received a life sentence, meaning she must serve at least 20 years before she can apply for parole. But after the trial, a shocking secret surfaced. Case files revealed that DNA tests showed Simona was actually adopted, carrying no biological connection to Radica at all. It was a truth Simona seemingly never knew while growing up. People wondered if finding out about her true roots or feeling lied to had sparked the deadly rage inside their home. Still, the actual motive for the brutal assault remained, shrouded in mystery after her conviction. In 2022, legal proceedings began over Radica's estate. The judge ruled that the killer would not receive a single cent of inheritance. This choice upheld the law that no murderer should ever profit financially from their heinous crimes. She eventually filed an appeal against her conviction, but in 2026, she remains locked up in a Queensland prison. Our next case involves a mind warped by dark delusions. Patricia Labisier had spent most of her adult life battling severe psychiatric conditions. Doctors had diagnosed her with conditions causing a complete break from reality and wild mood swings. She had been committed to psychiatric wards multiple times. One nagging delusion was that her mother, Julia Bradshaw, was practicing dark, harmful rituals. She claimed dark voices and her dead brother's ghost kept warning her about these sinister activities. Of course, these terrifying visions were symptoms of her illness, completely detached from reality. On October 27, 2000, she lived with her 67-year-old mother in Massachusetts. That night, she crept into her sleeping mother's bedroom. She stabbed her mother repeatedly with a knife and then calmly called the police. When dispatchers answered, she confessed to the attack, claiming she was simply sick of her mother's supposed behavior. The confession was chillingly blunt, displaying absolutely no regret for the bloody violence. Officers arrived at the home to find Julia Bradshaw dead from dozens of knife wounds. They arrested Patricia immediately. The case was simple since she had already confessed to everything on the phone. The physical evidence backed up her chilling story. For the legal system, the question was never whether Patricia committed the crime, but how her mental state should impact her trial. Her long struggle with psychiatric treatment was heavily documented. Her bizarre beliefs about her mother were false, yet entirely real to her. We have to wonder, how does justice handle such terrifying delusions? To avoid a full trial, Patricia agreed to a plea deal. On September 9, 2002, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and related charges. The deal accepted her guilt, but let the judge factor her fragile mental state into the sentencing. Justice Paul Carney sentenced Patricia to life in prison with potential parole, plus an additional 5 years to run concurrently. This meant she would eventually have a chance at freedom, provided she could prove she was no longer a danger. For decades, Patricia remained locked away behind bars. She underwent psychiatric therapy while locked away, and in 2020, she faced the parole board for the very first time. At that initial hearing, she finally addressed her horrific actions. Calling her choices drastic, she admitted there was no joy in what she did, yet she still branded her late mother a lifelong enemy. This suggested that despite treatment, some of her delusions still remain. In 2025, she stood before the board again, now 63, and having served 23 years of her sentence. A psychiatric expert testified for her, arguing that Patricia now posed a low risk of offending again. The expert explained that her advanced age and years of clinical care had minimized her potential for violence. But the board was highly skeptical. Patricia still harbored the exact same dark beliefs that led her to attack her mother. Those terrifying delusions had never fully faded, even after years of medication, leading to an incredibly tight vote. Some board members believed she was rehabilitated and that keeping her locked up was pointless, but others felt her lingering obsessions meant she was simply too dangerous to release. In the end, the board narrowly voted to deny her parole. State guidelines scheduled her next review for 2 years later, in 2027. Her victim's family strongly fought her release, convinced she remained a deadly threat. As of 2026, Patricia Labisier remains locked up in Massachusetts. It is a dark reminder of how difficult justice becomes when extreme mental illness drives violent crime. Let's look at another tragic case born from housing instability. Rebecca Olenchuk and her mother, Kimberly Venos, had been drifting without a real home since 2008. After losing their home to foreclosure, they stayed in a tiny hut in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, under extremely brutal conditions. The crude shack offered shelter but zero comfort, while Rebecca slaved away as a waitress to save cash. Her dream was to scrape together enough money for an apartment where they could live with dignity. She viewed a real home as their only escape, but money quickly became a source of toxic tension between them. Day after day, Rebecca hoarded every dollar she made at the diner. Finally, she had saved enough for a deposit and their first month of rent. Then came the devastating discovery. Kimberly had spent every cent. Her hard-earned savings were completely gone. When Rebecca furiously confronted her, Kimberly stubbornly refused to ever leave that miserable shack. She wouldn't even think about moving, even if her daughter managed to save the money all over again. On October 17, 2010, while Kimberly slept, Rebecca grabbed a baseball bat and made her move. She beat her sleeping mother's head 10 to 15 times, fracturing her skull in a brutal, defenseless onslaught. Next, Rebecca splashed highly flammable kerosene all over the floor. She sparked a match, setting the structure on fire, then padlocked the door from the outside to ensure her mother could never escape. Can severe poverty really push someone to commit such a terrifying act? Unbelievably, Kimberly survived the brutal bludgeoning despite her horrific injuries. She somehow crawled out of the burning inferno, and when paramedics arrived, she was still conscious. She told the emergency responders that her own daughter had tried to kill her. Those were her very last words before she succumbed to the brutal injuries and the suffocating smoke of the fire. The dying victim's own statement delivered key evidence about the crime, pointing directly to Rebecca before she fled the burning home. Authorities immediately launched a manhunt, eventually locating the suspect hiding out in Tennessee. Following her arrest, Rebecca confessed during questioning, explaining her rage over their depleted savings and her mother's stubborn refusal to leave their makeshift hut. The confession provided chilling details that perfectly matched the physical evidence at the scene. Forensic experts confirmed both the skull fractures from the bat and the severe burns from the fire. In June 2011, Rebecca went on trial in Bucks County, presenting her case directly to a judge without a jury. Extensive mental health evaluations had been conducted. Based on those psychiatric findings, she was found guilty but mentally ill of first-degree murder and arson. This specific designation meant that while she was legally responsible, severe mental health struggles had directly driven her actions. On October 13, 2011, Judge Sheparulo handed down the sentence. Rebecca was sentenced to life in prison without parole for taking her own mother's life. She received an additional 12.5 to 25 years for the arson, serving both sentences concurrently. This life sentence ensured she would never walk free, a fitting end to what prosecutors called an overwhelming case. Her defense team had tried desperately to focus on her extreme mental stress and deteriorating state of mind. Today, Rebecca Olenchuk is serving out her life sentence at SCI Cambridge Springs, following a transfer from SCI Muncie. This next case involves an elderly victim and a calculated cover-up. Julia Delooney. It was January 2024 in the Kandala area of Wellington, New Zealand, where 53-year-old Julia Delooney lived with her 79-year-old mother, Helen Gregory. Helen was frail and vulnerable, relying entirely on her daughter for care, but their relationship had grown deeply strained. Investigators would later uncover a massive breach of trust, point-blank centered around their financial affairs. At trial, the state revealed the true motive: a bitter dispute over Julia stealing her mother's life savings, which the elderly woman had discovered only days before the attack. In January 2024, Julia unleashed a brutal, sustained assault on her own mother. Poor Helen suffered devastating injuries from being struck repeatedly. The sheer violence of the wounds showed incredible force, and Helen quickly succumbed to her injuries. Immediately after, Julia set out to hide her terrible crime. She extensively scrubbed the scene to remove any traces of the assault, staging the home to make it look like an accident. Once Helen's death was reported, police immediately launched a full investigation. Responding to what was first called a suspicious death, investigators quickly noticed glaring inconsistencies in the crime scene. The physical evidence simply didn't match the story Julia was telling them. Detectives quickly shifted their focus to Julia. closely examining the fractured relationship between mother and daughter. They combed through banking records, phone messages, and analyzed the physical evidence left at the house. What drives someone to brutally murder the elderly parent in their care? This intense investigation culminated in murder charges, sending Julia Delooney to stand trial at the High Court in Wellington. Throughout the trial, the prosecution detailed the horrific blunt force trauma Helen suffered and showed proof of Julia's frantic cleanup attempts. They laid bare the ultimate betrayal of trust that had shattered this mother-daughter relationship. While her defense tried to argue alternative theories, Julia steadfastly refused to take responsibility, but the jury weighed every shred of damning evidence over the trial. They retreated to deliberate on everything they had heard and seen. In July 2025, they returned with a verdict, finding Julia guilty of murder. The conviction confirmed the jury's belief that the evidence proved Julia had taken her mother's life. With a guilty verdict secured, Justice Churchman presided over a somber sentencing hearing. On September 5, 2025, Justice Churchman sentenced Julia to life in prison with a minimum of 18 years before parole. The judge condemned the brutal assault, highlighting how vulnerable elderly Helen was, completely dependent on her own daughter. In court, the judge noted there were absolutely no mitigating factors to justify a lighter sentence. Even after her conviction, Julia's ongoing denial of guilt was heavily noted. That 18-year minimum meant Julia could not even apply for parole until she served every single day of that time. Helen Gregory's devastated family shared statements describing the massive, painful ripple effect her sudden loss had sent through their lives. Helen was someone they had loved and relied on for everything. Realizing her own daughter caused her death made their crushing grief so much harder to process. They had to grieve Helen while processing the horrific truth that Julia, one of their own, took her life. Julia Delooney remains locked away in New Zealand as of 2026. She cannot apply for parole until 2043, when she will be in her early 70s. If you have made it this far and love diving into shocking criminal cases, tap that subscribe button and remember to hit the notification bell. The next case begins with a violent clash that ended with a body dumped in the wilderness. Gazal Mansuri, who preferred the name Jessica, had been living in San Diego for 30 years. Born in Jordan with deep family roots in Afghanistan, she lived in Serra Mesa with her 79-year-old mother, Marima Mansuri. Over the years, the bond between mother and daughter slowly crumbled. Arguing became constant, and substance abuse issues only made the explosive household tension much worse. On September 23, 2013, Gazal and her mother clashed violently. The argument escalated, and during the clash, Marima was strangled. Prosecutors later argued that Marima had been strangled with a rubber bicycle inner tube. This crucial forensic clue directly matched tools and spare items discovered inside the family's garage. With her mother dead, Gazal faced a grim choice about what to do with the body. Instead of calling police, she hid the crime, driving her mother's body to a desolate area near the Barona Reservation, miles from home. Marima's remains were finally discovered on October 2, 2013. The dumping spot was completely isolated, which was almost certainly intentional. Left outside, the body was fully exposed to the elements and local wildlife. Local animals had caused devastating damage to her remains. Securing the scene, detectives began the difficult task of identifying the victim and uncovering what transpired. The trail quickly led straight to Gazal, leaving detectives wondering what could drive a daughter to do this. Under police interrogation, Gazal admitted she had dumped her mother's body in the wilderness. However, she insisted she was not responsible for her mother's death. She tried spinning a story, claiming she simply found her mother dead and panicked, not knowing what else to do. But forensics told a different story, as signs of strangulation proved it was an intentional attack, not natural causes. Furthermore, hiding the body so far away clearly showed she knew exactly what she had done was wrong. The case headed to trial in January 2015. The prosecution detailed the highly toxic relationship between the mother and daughter. They showed the jury how Marima died and where she was dumped, arguing the strangulation and cover-up proved a deliberate, cold-blooded crime. Her defense team tried to argue that Gazal never meant to cause her mother's death, suggesting the fight simply spiraled far beyond what she originally planned. Ultimately, the jury convicted Gazal of first-degree murder. The guilty verdict proved they believed she planned the killing and deliberately hid the body. On March 6, 2015, Gazal was sentenced to 25 years to life, meaning she must serve at least 25 years before even being considered for parole. At the sentencing, Mehrima's grieving family members spoke about their immense loss. One niece openly described Gazal's cold actions as completely inhuman. The grieving family simply could not comprehend how anyone could treat their own mother with such cruelty, dumping her body in a remote spot, leaving Mehrima's remains exposed to wild animals and the elements, was incredibly cold. Throughout the trial and sentencing, Gazal showed absolutely no remorse for what had happened. In 2026, Gazal Mansuri remains behind bars in California. While her standard parole eligibility lands in the late 2030s, a special elderly parole program might change things. Gazal could be eligible for a hearing as early as 2034, assuming she keeps a clean record, and because she was over 50 during her time behind bars. Another tragic case highlights severe mental illness driving someone to extreme actions. Delilah Sherwood Evans grew up enduring a deeply troubled childhood. She struggled with severe psychological issues, hearing phantom voices and believing things completely disconnected from reality. By age 17, her severe mental health issues remained largely untreated and desperately mismanaged. She lived with her mother, Sonia Riang, whose physical disabilities left her vulnerable and completely dependent on others. On Christmas Day in 2011, in Clinton Township, Michigan, a horrific tragedy unfolded inside the home they shared. Without warning, Delilah launched a relentless, brutal assault on her own mother. Sonia was stabbed between 111 and 124 times, indicating a prolonged, frenzied assault. Disabled and helpless, Sonia stood absolutely no chance of defending herself or escaping her daughter. She tragically succumbed to her massive injuries. Following the bloodshed, Delilah began scrubbing the crime scene, desperately trying to erase any physical evidence of her crime. She then fled the home, but police quickly tracked her down at a local store and arrested her. Under questioning, Delilah claimed she believed her mother had been practicing dark and dangerous spiritual rituals. She claimed Sonia was involved in activities that felt deeply threatening to her. These bizarre claims clearly showed her severe psychosis, not what was actually happening. How exactly does the legal system handle such extreme violence when driven by deep psychosis? Delilah underwent extensive, in-depth psychological evaluations. Clinical experts diagnosed her with disorders causing extreme mood disturbances and severe delusions. They concluded she was suffering from intense psychosis during the attack. The court now faced a massive question. Could she be held criminally responsible for her actions? Her trial finally began in 2018. Prosecutors laid out a mountain of forensic evidence detailing the horrific nature of the wounds, while the defense countered with her psychiatric history. Ultimately, the jury found Delilah guilty but mentally ill of first-degree murder. This specific verdict proved she committed the terrible act, but recognized her severe psychosis was a major factor. On April 5, 2018, the judge sentenced Delilah to life in prison without any possibility of parole. The court described the stabbing as incredibly brutal. Sonia's family sat through the agonizing trial, demanding justice despite the killer's mental health. But this tragic case was far from over. In 2021, an appellate court reviewed her conviction. They discovered that detectives had subjected Delilah to highly improper questioning during the investigation. Prosecutors had relied on confession statements that never should have been allowed in court. Due to this critical error, her conviction was overturned, and a new trial was ordered for 2022. This meant Delilah would face a brand new jury to decide her legal responsibility. In December 2023, Delilah avoided a retrial by pleading no contest but mentally ill to second-degree murder. She received a 20 to 40-year sentence with credit for the 12 years already served. The next case involves deadly greed taken to the ultimate extreme. Candace Craig. In May 2023, in Prince George's County, Maryland, 46-year-old Candace Craig lived with her 71-year-old mother, Margaret. Severe money problems had created a toxic wave of tension in their home. Candace had secretly been stealing from her mother's pension and Social Security checks. When Margaret discovered the theft, she finally confronted her daughter. That explosive clash triggered one of the most horrifying criminal cases in recent Maryland history. As they fought over money, Candace brutally strangled her mother. Margaret died right there, But what happened next absolutely terrified investigators and the local community. Instead of calling the police or burying the body in the woods, Candace chose a far more sinister path. She grabbed a chainsaw and hacked her mother's body to pieces. She laid the remains onto a grill and set them ablaze. In a chilling bid to destroy evidence, she stuffed the leftover body parts into trash bags in the basement. She actually kept living in that house with those horrific remains nearby. She even recruited her own daughter, Salia Hardy, to help her. Dragging a second generation into this horrific crime made the case even more twisted. This gruesome routine might have continued, but eventually the police were tipped off. When officers arrived for a wellness check, they stumbled upon the sickening truth. What they found inside shook even the most hardened, veteran detectives. Could simple financial greed really drive a daughter to such madness? As detectives uncovered the full horror of Candace's actions, her daughter Salia became the state's star witness. She admitted she didn't witness the actual murder, but she did help her mother chop up and burn the body on a charcoal grill. Her testimony was incredibly graphic, but the jury needed to hear the raw truth of what happened. Cold forensic evidence backed up her story. The bones found in the basement matched Margaret Craig, and the burn marks confirmed the brutal disposal methods. The trial began in November 2024, lasting just 8 grueling days. Jurors listened to Salia's terrifying testimony and heard from the detectives who worked the crime scene. They were shown grim forensic proof of the butchering and burning. Prosecutors argued Candace deliberately killed her mother just to keep pocketing her financial benefits. They highlighted the horrific lengths she went to destroy the evidence. Facing overwhelming physical evidence and her own daughter's testimony, the defense had almost nothing to say. The jury convicted Candace of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. In February 2025, Candace Craig was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 18 years, for murdering her own mother and carrying out the sickening dismemberment and destruction of the remains. During the sentencing, the court laid bare the utter horror of what was done to Margaret, snuffed out, chopped up, and incinerated by her own flesh and blood, all for a handful of cash. To Candace, her mother's life was nothing more than a steady paycheck she refused to lose. Employing a chainsaw and a backyard grill showed a desperate plan to erase Margaret's very existence. In 2026, Candace Craig remains locked up in Maryland. This chilling case grabbed national headlines, fueled by the gruesome disposal methods and cold-blooded financial greed. Another case involved a calculated, cold-blooded plot, rather than a sudden outburst. Jennifer Pan. Raised in Markham, Ontario, Jennifer was the child of Vietnamese immigrants who demanded absolute perfection from their kids. Her parents, Bich and Hue Han Pan, micromanaged her life and mapped out her entire future. Under this crushing pressure, Jennifer began spinning an incredibly complex web of lies to satisfy them. She forged report cards and even faked going to college when she was not even registered. She built an entire shadow life, and her parents fell for it completely. But as she grew older, maintaining this massive facade became nearly impossible. Her overbearing parents strictly controlled her personal life, completely banning her from dating. She was secretly seeing a man they despised, leaving her utterly suffocated between the future they demanded and the life she desperately wanted. The pressure mounted for years. Finally, she made a dark, unthinkable choice that would shatter her community. She decided to plot her parents' murder. In November 2010, Jennifer set a deadly plan into motion. She recruited her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong, and other accomplices to target her parents' house. On November 8th, hitmen stormed the house, shooting and killing Jennifer's mother, Bich Ha. Her father, Hue Han, was also shot but miraculously survived. The cold-blooded attack was staged to look like a random robbery. Jennifer played the traumatized victim, claiming the intruders tied her up. How could a daughter plot such horror against her own parents? But her father lived, and he was ready to tell detectives what really happened. He revealed that the intruders seemed to know the family, instantly shattering Jennifer's fake robbery story. Suspicion shifted straight to Jennifer, and her story crumbled under intense police questioning. She kept changing her story. Detectives spotted glaring contradictions, eventually uncovering solid proof linking her to the murder plot. Text messages, witness testimonies, and call logs proved Jennifer was at the center of it all. During the 2014 trial, prosecutors exposed the web of elaborate lies Jennifer spun for years. They argued that she felt trapped and saw murder as her only way out. The state laid out damning evidence of her planning the brutal ambush. Her motives were clear: freedom and insurance money. Then, her own father took the stand to testify against her. It was an agonizing moment for everyone. In 2015, Jennifer was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with no parole for 25 years. Yet she maintained her innocence. So, she appealed the verdict. In June 2024, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed a decision ordering a new trial on her first-degree murder charge. However, her conviction for trying to kill her father still stands. As of 2026, Jennifer awaits her retrial behind bars at the Grand Valley Institution for Women in Ontario. Our next case involves the toxic influence of an older partner. Jasmine Richardson was born on October 21, 1993, in Medicine Hat, Canada. She grew up in a normal middle-class home with her parents, Deborah and Mark. She also had a younger brother. By all accounts, Jasmine was a good student who seemed to be doing just fine. But as she entered her teens, she became deeply drawn to alternative online subcultures. She started identifying with dark internet communities, radically changing her look and her attitude. At just 12 years old, she got involved with a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Steinke. The age gap was deeply alarming. When her parents found out, they strongly disapproved of the relationship. They strictly forbade Jasmine from seeing Jeremy and set hard rules to separate them. For a rebellious preteen like Jasmine, these new boundaries felt like torture. Instead of obeying her parents, she and Jeremy began plotting a horrific way out. On April 23, 2006, Jeremy went to the Richardson home in Medicine Hat. What happened that night shook the entire town. Deborah and Mark Richardson were brutally stabbed to death. Neither survived their injuries. Tragically, Jasmine's little brother was also attacked and did not survive. With her entire family wiped out, Jasmine packed her bags and fled with Jeremy. The bloody crime scene showed a chilling determination to finish the job. Could a 12-year-old really understand the permanent consequences? Police caught them quickly after tips flooded in. After his arrest, Jeremy made boastful statements, seemingly proud of the brutal slaughter. The investigation quickly showed that the couple had fully planned the murders beforehand. They spoke about removing anything standing in the way of their romance. Secret messages proved they had fully agreed on how to execute the plot. The real challenge was how to charge someone so young, given that Jasmine was only 12 during the crimes. Charged as a juvenile under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, she went to trial in 2007. Because she was so young, strict publication bans shielded her real identity. Prosecutors laid out evidence that she helped plan and execute the slaughter of her family, while the defense pointed to her youth and Jeremy's toxic influence over her. In 2007, the jury found Jasmine guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. But, since she was only a child, her sentence looked very different from an adult's. The judge handed down 10 years in intensive rehabilitation, the absolute maximum penalty allowed under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. This penalty prioritized healing and rehabilitation over simple, raw punishment. Jasmine cycled through several facilities, completing intense therapy and continuing her education. Behind bars, she reportedly expressed deep remorse for the horrific fate of her family. In May 2016, after serving her complete sentence, Jasmine Richardson was set free. Since she was convicted as a minor, her criminal record was permanently sealed and locked away from the public eye once her sentence officially ended. Strict publication bans ensure her new identity and current location remain a total mystery. Jeremy Steinke faced a far darker fate as an adult, receiving life in prison with 0 chance of parole for 25 years. He remains behind bars today. Now, let's look at another case that raises deep questions about wrongful convictions. Norah Jackson already knew deep trauma. In 2004, her father was snatched away in a brutal, unsolved murder. Shaken by this loss, Norah lived in Memphis, Tennessee with her mother, Jennifer Jackson. But as Norah hit her teens, the bond between mother and daughter began to fracture. They clashed constantly over rules and personal freedom. Norah started experimenting with drugs, a rebellion her mother absolutely refused to tolerate. On June 5, 2005, Jennifer was found dead in her home. stabbed over 50 times. It was a bloodbath, the result of a frenzied, highly personal attack. Investigators immediately started hunting for anyone with a motive and a clear window of opportunity. Suspicion quickly fell on her daughter Norah, especially after detectives learned she had been out partying the night of the murder. Every minute of Norah's timeline was placed under a microscope, yet prosecutors faced a massive roadblock in building a case against her. Absolutely no forensic evidence linked Norah to the scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, and zero physical proof connected her to the slaying. Yet, despite this empty hand, prosecutors pushed ahead with formal charges. Instead, they built a circumstantial case around their tense relationship and the massive inheritance Norah stood to gain. The highly anticipated trial began in February 2009. The prosecution argued that Norah killed her mother for money and spite. But ask yourself, can someone really be convicted with zero physical evidence? The jury weighed the circumstantial story, debating whether the thin trail of clues was truly enough. Ultimately, they found Norah guilty of second-degree murder. On March 27, 2009, she received 20 years and 9 months, as the judge condemned her for betraying her mother's love. Norah still maintained her innocence, fiercely denying any role in her mother's violent death. Regardless, the conviction stood, and she began serving her long sentence. But a secret kept from the jury would eventually change everything. During the trial, the state had buried crucial evidence that could have saved her. Key files about other viable suspects and solid alibis were hidden from the defense, directly violating the law. This severe prosecutorial misconduct was eventually exposed. Armed with this revelation, Norah's lawyers immediately filed an appeal. In August 2014, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned her conviction. They ruled that the hidden evidence could have easily changed the verdict. To avoid a second trial, Norah accepted an Alford plea in 2015. Norah Jackson accepted an Alford plea for voluntary manslaughter. It was a far lighter charge than second-degree murder, securing her immediate release in August 2016. Since then, Norah has lived quietly, still insisting she had nothing to do with her mother's death. With no physical evidence linking her to the scene, doubts still linger over whether she was actually the killer. Severe misconduct by the prosecution led to her conviction being thrown out, exposing deep flaws in how the case was run. The tragedy tore Jennifer Jackson's family apart, leaving some convinced of Norah's guilt. Others wondered if the real killer was still out there. Even in 2026, the mystery of who ended Jennifer Jackson's life remains officially unsolved. This unique plea leaves Norah with a conviction, though she still maintains her innocence. Withheld evidence and the lack of forensic proof convince many that an innocent woman was condemned. That is our story for today. Thanks for watching. Click right here to see more.